It's a pleasure to speak to you at this WCRF conference, but it's a pleasure tinged with a little sadness. I'm delighted to introduce this topic of global inequalities and implications for research, practice and policy. The reason I can't be here in person, hence my sadness, relates to the topic of my lecture. I chaired a commission on social determinants of health for the World Health Organization, and then was involved in a similar exercise for the British government, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, asking, in the light of the WHO Commission, what could we do on health inequalities? I've now been asked by the European region of WHO to conduct a similar review for WHO Euro. And I have to be in Moscow at the regional committee to explain to the regional committee what the review is about and to get their blessing and indeed their buy-in. Hence, I'm not here in person. As while you be watching this, I will be talking to the regional committee in Moscow. I'll say something about cancer as we go through, but the Global Commission and indeed the English review were looking at the problem of health more generally. One way of measuring health is life expectancy. Look here at the global picture. This is life expectancy for men in different countries. In Sierra Leone, life expectancy for men is under 40 years. In Iceland, it's 80. And you see this dramatic difference among countries. It's tempting to say that inequalities in health are a matter for them in the poor countries, and we in the rich countries don't suffer from it to anything like the same extent. But that's why I've put the figures for Glasgow on this graph. Men in the poorest part of Glasgow have a life expectancy of 54. Men in the richest part have a life expectancy of 82, a 28-year difference in life expectancy within one Scottish city. Men in the poorest part of Glasgow have life expectancy that is 8 years shorter than the average in India. In India, 75% of the population lives on $2 a day or less, and nobody in Glasgow lives on $2 a day. In Glasgow, they don't suffer from communicable disease to any great extent. The causes of death responsible for this appalling carnage are cardiovascular disease, cancer, alcohol-related causes, including violence. And so powerful are the operations of the social determinants of health that you can get this picture of the poorest people of Glasgow having life expectancy 8 years shorter than the Indian average. Look what's happened to regions over time. The earliest point on this graph comes from the 1950s, and it takes us through to 2000 to 2005. In the rich countries, we always had good health, and it's continued to improve. In some of the poorer regions of the world, health has improved dramatically. But look at sub-Saharan Africa, lagged behind, and in fact things have been getting worse. To show you this in a bit more detail, let's look at a small number of specific countries. UK in the brown was at the top there in the 1950s. Japan, which was significantly behind the UK in life expectancy in the 1950s, had this absolutely dramatic improvement, so that life expectancy in Japan now is longer than the UK. A country like Costa Rica, a relatively low-income country, but always with good life expectancy, and now their life expectancy is indistinguishable from that in the UK, despite national income in Costa Rica being less than half, more like a third, at purchasing power parities of that in the United Kingdom. Now look at those two at the bottom. Zambia and Vietnam. They were both improving a little until the 1970s. You'll be familiar with the major political changes that happened in Vietnam after the 1970s. And Vietnam got this dramatic improvement in life expectancy, and in Zambia, things plateaued and then got worse. The reason I've shown you this in some detail is there's absolutely no reason to accept that these major differences in health and life expectancy that we see across the world are inevitable. Life expectancy in a given country can change dramatically, and the relative position and the differences among countries can change dramatically in a relatively short time. And if we can understand the reasons for these changes, it means potentially we can get a handle on what to do to make things better. Here we look at the pattern as well as the rates of causes of death, adult mortality. At the bottom is Africa, high mortality in adults aged 15 to 59. You can see, starting from the far end, maternal and nutritional conditions and other infectious and parasitic diseases, HIV/AIDS. But look at the importance of injury and non-communicable disease in Africa. Now, when you look at every other region, the non-communicable diseases plus injury are more important causes of death than communicable diseases, even in Southeast Asia. And when we look at what's projected to happen over time, for low-income countries, you can see that the importance of communicable disease is projected to decline by 2015, and non-communicable disease will become relatively more important. And in every other region of the world, the present situation is set to continue. And that shows quite how important non-communicable diseases are globally, not just in the high-income countries. For the moment, I'm talking about non-communicable disease because one of the points we made in the WCRF report on diet and cancer was that much of what we had to say about diet and cancer applied to other major non-communicable diseases. So for the moment, I've been treating them together. But of course, cancer itself has become increasingly important in many low and middle income countries. In China, 44% of deaths are cardiovascular disease, but 22% cancer. 22% respiratory disease, diabetes, and other, among non-communicable causes of death. But non-communicable causes of death are the dominant causes in cancer. And to the right, you see which specific cancer sites dominate in China. Stomach, very high in both sexes, but then lung, again, high in both sexes. In the UK, cancer looms somewhat larger as a proportion of non-communicable causes of death, 33%. And looking by gender, prostate, then lung, colorectum, stomach is somewhat less important. And for women, breast is extremely important. Coming back then to life expectancy. I've talked about the differences across the world. I've shown you that the differences between the top and the bottom in Glasgow fit very much into the global scale of differences among countries. But one of the major scientific findings that the Global Commission and the English Review, and indeed health policy, has to deal with is not just the differences between top and bottom, but the social gradient. These are data from the US. Areas are classified by level of socioeconomic deprivation. One being the least affluent, the most deprived, 10 being the most affluent, the least deprived. And what's striking is the social gradient, not just the difference between 1 and 10, but 8 has shorter life expectancy than 10, 7 shorter than 8, 3 shorter than 4, 1 shorter than 2. Now, when we look at these 3 time periods, look at 1. Life expectancy is improved by about 1.8 years in the most deprived, and life expectancy is improved by 1, 2, 3, nearly 3.5 years in the most affluent. So the social gradient is getting steeper. It's changing before our very eyes. If it can get steeper, then in theory at least, it ought to be possible to make it less steep. That was the United States. If we look at England, what we've got here is plotting every local area in the country according to the level of neighbourhood income deprivation. So to the right-hand end, you've got the least deprived. To the left-hand end, you've got the most deprived. And the top graph is life expectancy. And just as I showed you with the US figures, it's a social gradient. People near the top have shorter life expectancy than those at the top. Those in the middle, shorter life expectancy than those near the top. Those a third from the bottom, shorter than those in the middle. It's not just the difference between top and bottom. If we do want to look at the difference between top and bottom, take the 5th centile and the 95th centile, the difference in life expectancy is 7 years. You can pull out extremes like the 28 years in Glasgow, but on average, it's 7 years. The bottom graph is disability-free life expectancy. In other words, not just looking at length of life, but length of life lived healthily, free from disability. Again, it's a gradient, but the gradient now is steeper than it was for life expectancy. The gap between the 5th and the 95th centile is now not 7 years, but 17 years. And that means that on average, people at the top are living about 12 years of their lives with disability, and people at the bottom, albeit with shorter lives, are living about 20 years of those lives with disability. Now, when most people think about inequalities in health, they think about the poor health of the poor. The poor do have poor health. But the real issue is the social gradient. The fact is, the more deprived, the worse their health. It's not only those at the bottom. And several cancers follow this gradient, particularly lung cancer, but others as well. I'm particularly interested in prevention, which means looking at incidence, but treatment matters too. This slide looks at the ratio of mortality to incidence in a specific year by cancer type and country income. So look at the low-income countries, and for all these different cancer types, the ratio between mortality and incidence is somewhat higher. As you move towards the high-income countries, the ratio between mortality and incidence is somewhat lower. One way of interpreting this is that incidence, the onset of cancer, is followed more immediately by death in the low-income countries and less so in the high-income countries. That may be due to differences in the biology of the cancer, that there should be these differences in cancer survival, but it may, of course, be due to the management and treatment of cancers. Data from Norway looked at cancer specifically rather than simply all-cause mortality that goes into life expectancy by a measure of socioeconomic position, years of education. And here in an egalitarian Nordic country, Norway, you can see the more years of education, the lower the relative risk of death from cancer. A social gradient once again. The social determinants of health, which account for these big differences, for example, across countries and by social position within countries, have important implications for research. Different kinds of evidence. We should be looking not only downstream, for example, at biological causes of cancer, not only at causes such as diet and exercise, but what we called on the Global Commission the causes of the causes. So patterns of diet are causes of cancer. What are the causes of the patterns of diet that we see? Smoking is a cause of cancer. What are the causes of smoking? And in particular, what accounts for the social gradient in smoking? So we need different kinds of evidence. And that relates to policy, not just to do with treatment, but prevention as well. Understanding that there are important social determinants of health is an understanding that all policies affect health, not only healthcare policy. And that leads to a recommendation that we made both on the Global Commission and on the English Review, that all policies should be screened for their impact on health and on the fair distribution of health, health equity. And in terms of public health and clinical practice, there should be evaluation in terms of health equity, and practice should develop on the basis of evidence. The Global Commission report, which was published in 2008, 2 years ago, more or less to the date, we called Closing the Gap in a Generation. I argued that the knowledge we have is sufficient to make an enormous difference to the major inequalities in health we see within and between countries. And putting these inequalities right is a matter of social justice. We saw empowerment as key to taking action on social determinants of health. And we saw empowerment in three ways: material, having enough money to live on; psychosocial, having control over your life; and political, having voice. And we said it's important not just to say individuals have to have control over their lives, but to create the conditions for people to take control of their lives. In the Global Commission report, we had 3 principles of action: the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age; the structural drivers of those conditions at global and national level and local level; and the importance of monitoring, training, and research. We saw the Commission report as a call to action. But in none of the areas where we made recommendations would I say the evidence is nearly as good as we would like it to be. And it's vitally important to evaluate the effect of our actions. So, although the Commission report could be seen as a call to action, it could also be seen as a research agenda, hence the importance of monitoring, training, and research. And in the circumstances of daily life, we had recommendations on early child development and education, healthy places, fair employment, social protection, and universal health care. And in the structural drivers, the importance of having health equity in all policies, good global governance, gender equity, political empowerment, inclusion and voice, market responsibility, and fair financing. I was invited by the Secretary of State for Health of the previous government in England, as I said at the beginning, to conduct a review of health inequalities in light of the Global Commission report. In other words, the question is, how could we translate the general findings of this global report in a form that was suitable to take action on health inequalities in this country? With the help of the best scientists we could find in Britain, we conducted that review over a 12-month period, and we published in February this year and gave the review the title Fair Society, Healthy Lives. It proceeded from the fundamental assumption that if you take action to create a fair society, health will improve and health inequalities will diminish. In other words, we should put fairness at the heart of all policy. The word fairness has been bandied around a lot lately. I think we should take fairness rather seriously. And harking back to the global report, we said we wanted to create the conditions in which individuals and communities have control over their lives. Our recommendations fell in 6 domains. Give every child the best start in life. So when I get asked, well, why won't people listen to advice about smoking, exercise, healthy eating, sensible drinking? How should we deal with better health education? And my response is I wouldn't start from here. I would start with early child development. Give people the best start in life, and they'll develop the skills to handle the health education material that's being thrust at them. And that relates to our second domain, which is education. Enable all children, young people and adults to maximize their capabilities and have control over their lives. To deal, in other words, with the major social gradients in educational performance. The third was creating employment and good work for all, a key issue with the economic downturn. The fourth does relate to income. It's the only one of our 6 domains that directly relates to income, and that's really radical. It's doing the calculation of how much money people need to have a healthy life and ensuring that people, whether employed or on benefits, have enough money to lead a healthy life. The fifth was to create and develop healthy and sustainable places and communities. And here's an area where the climate change, environmental agenda and the health equity, health inequalities agenda should come together. And the sixth was strengthening the role and impact of ill health prevention. We saw these 6 domains as the concrete steps to take to create a fair society. In fact, if we really want to do something major about improving health and diminishing health inequalities, we need to take action at this social, economic, and political level. The struggle is a considerable one, but so are the gains. And this is an intensely ethical endeavor in which we are engaged. Thank you.